At $10,000, you're barely escaping the ground. But at $500,000, you can be flying above the weather faster than some private jets. 4 budgets, 4 completely different aircraft, and somewhere between them, personal aviation stops being a hobby and becomes serious transportation. Tier 1, $10,000, the cheapest way to put yourself in the sky. At $10,000, forget the image of a small private airplane sitting inside a polished hangar. You're starting much lower than that. Think Paramotor, Quicksilver MX, or a Badland F3. These machines aren't trying to imitate a business jet. They're built around one simple idea: get one person into the air without making the whole thing complicated. And honestly, that's what makes this tier so fascinating. A paramotor can look almost absurdly simple when you first see one. There's an engine and propeller behind the pilot, a frame, a wing overhead, and that's about it. No luxury cabin, no complicated interior. You don't even need a runway in the conventional sense. Find a suitable open field, get the wing inflated, and suddenly the ground starts getting smaller. For someone who's only ever seen aviation as something that requires an airport, this changes everything. Under FAR Part 103, qualifying ultralights can operate without the traditional pilot certificate requirements that apply to conventional aircraft. That dramatically lowers the barrier to entry. You're not spending years preparing for a private pilot certificate just to experience what it feels like to leave the ground. But don't let that low barrier fool you. You're paying for simplicity by giving up a lot. These aircraft are slow, with typical cruising speeds around 30 to 45 miles per hour, and they're highly dependent on the conditions around them. A beautiful, calm morning can feel perfect. Then the wind changes, and suddenly the flight you planned isn't happening. That's the part nobody puts on the price tag. Imagine standing beside your aircraft, ready to fly, and watching the trees start moving harder and harder. The engine is ready. You are ready. But the weather says no. At this level, you don't simply choose when to fly. The conditions have a much bigger say in the decision. And maintenance is different, too. You're not dealing with the same kind of ownership environment as a conventional personal airplane. Basic machines can be much easier to work on, and some owners can keep them in a garage rather than paying for a full-time hangar. That's a huge advantage when your entire goal is keeping aviation within reach. But there is another catch, and this one matters. You are generally flying alone. The low-cost ultralight world isn't about loading up your family and heading across the country. There's no second passenger seat waiting for your friend. No comfortable cabin where you can escape the wind. It's you, the machine, and the sky. And that actually makes the $10,000 aircraft surprisingly honest. You're not buying transportation, you're buying access. You're buying the experience of looking down and realizing that the ground is no longer where you are. But here's where the story gets interesting. What happens when you add another $40,000? Because at $50,000, the aircraft doesn't just become more expensive. The entire mission starts to change. Tier 2, $50,000. When a personal plane becomes actually useful. At $50,000, personal aviation starts feeling less like an experiment and more like something you could actually use. This is where aircraft such as the RotorX Phoenix, Zenith CH-701, and Cessna 150 enter the picture. They're very different designs, but they share one important idea. Now you're sitting inside an airplane instead of simply hanging underneath a wing.
This one, of course, is turbocharged. You can tell by the exhaust system. Shaft-driven tail rotor system. Gearbox at the aft end. Gearbox at the fore end of the tail boom.
The first major difference is the way you interact with the aircraft. You're no longer completely exposed to the sky. You have a cockpit, controls, instruments, and an airframe designed around actual transportation. It may still be small, but the feeling is different. The airplane starts behaving like a machine you can plan around rather than something you take out only when the weather happens to be perfect. There's another change hiding underneath the price. Depending on the aircraft and how it's operated, you're now looking at the sport or private pilot licensing world rather than the ultralight rules of the previous tier. That adds training and responsibility, but it also opens the door to a much broader kind of flying. And then the numbers start moving. Cruising somewhere around 80 to 110 miles per hour, these aircraft can cover regional distances without feeling like you're simply floating around your local field. A trip that would take a long time by road can become a short flight. Suddenly, the airplane has a purpose. The Zenith CH-701 makes that idea especially interesting because of its short takeoff and landing capability. You don't necessarily need the same runway environment you'd associate with larger aircraft. That rugged, STOL-oriented personality makes it feel more like a machine built to get into places, rather than simply get from one airport to another.
He said, "What you good at?" And I said, "Holding the stick and making Afghans for security."
The Cessna 150 represents another side of the same story. It's a familiar light aircraft formula. Compact, relatively straightforward, and designed around the idea of accessible personal flying. And depending on the aircraft and engine setup, fuel options can include MOGAS or AVGAS where approved. Now imagine the ownership difference. At $10,000, your biggest advantage was simply being able to own something that flies. At $50,000, you're beginning to think about destinations. You can imagine taking a short regional trip, landing somewhere for lunch, and coming home the same afternoon. Fuel can also remain surprisingly manageable compared with larger aircraft. For some efficient STOL and light aircraft setups, fuel costs can work out to under $40 per hour, depending on the engine, fuel price, and actual consumption. That's where the math starts becoming interesting. You're not just buying an airplane. You're buying a way to turn certain road journeys into flights. Of course, $50,000 doesn't magically remove the compromises. You still have weather limitations, maintenance, insurance, training, storage, and the reality that a small aircraft is still a small aircraft. But the psychological jump is enormous. At 10 grand, you're asking, can I fly? At 50 grand, you're asking, where can I go? And that question changes everything, because now we've reached the point where the airplane is useful. But usefulness isn't the same thing as performance. What if you want something faster, more modern, more exciting, and something that actually looks like it belongs in the future? That's where the next tier gets weird. Tier 3, $150,000. When personal planes start feeling like sports cars. At $150,000, the personal aircraft world takes another sharp turn. You're no longer limited to basic trainers and practical short-hop machines. Now you can start looking at aircraft such as the Icon of 5, Sonex SubSonex, and Kitfox S7STI. And suddenly, personal aviation starts looking a lot more like a collection of flying toys designed by people who refuse to keep things boring. Take the Icon of 5. On paper, it's already different. It's an amphibious aircraft, meaning water isn't just something you're flying over. Under the right conditions, it's part of the operating environment. Add its folding wing concept, and suddenly storage becomes part of the aircraft's appeal too. Think about that for a second. You can have an aircraft that looks like a sports car, fold its wings, and potentially move or store it in ways a conventional airplane simply can't. Then take it somewhere near the water, and the whole mission changes again. But the Icon isn't the only reason this tier gets interesting. The Sonex SubSonex takes the idea in a completely different direction. Instead of focusing on amphibious adventure, it brings microjet performance into the personal aircraft world. It's tiny, it's experimental, and it has the kind of shape that makes people stop and ask what on earth they're looking at. Then there's the Kitfox S7STI, which takes another route. Instead of chasing jet-like novelty, it focuses on lightweight performance and practical high-performance flying. With aircraft in this category, using engines such as the RotorX 912 or 915 series, you're getting a major step up in capability without turning the aircraft into an enormous machine. And then the cockpit starts catching your attention. Modern light aircraft can be equipped with glass cockpits, replacing the wall of traditional analog instruments with digital displays that put flight information directly in front of the pilot. Some aircraft also offer systems such as BRS ballistic parachutes, adding another layer of safety technology. This is where the $150,000 tier starts messing with your expectations. You're looking at aircraft with modern avionics, folding wings, water capability, high-performance engines, and even micro-turbine power. For a second, it almost feels like the price doesn't make sense. But here's the twist. The money isn't simply buying speed, it's buying options. You can choose an aircraft for adventure. You can choose one for speed. You can choose one for rough field capability. You can choose one because it looks absolutely insane sitting on the ramp. And that emotional difference matters. The $50,000 airplane says, "Let's get somewhere." The $150,000 airplane starts saying, "Let's have some fun getting there." But now the biggest question is sitting right in front of us. If $150,000 already gets you modern avionics, advanced designs, amphibious capability, and even a microjet, why would anyone spend $500,000? Because the next jump isn't really about making the airplane prettier. It's about making the airplane dramatically more capable. Tier 4. $500,000 plus, when your personal plane starts chasing private jets. At $500,000 and above, the game changes again. Aircraft such as a PT-6 converted Beechcraft Duke, Lancair Evolution, and Turbine Legend move personal aviation into territory where the words fast and serious finally start meaning something very different. Now we're talking about 250 to 300 plus miles per hour cruise speeds. And that's not just a small improvement over the $50,000 aircraft. It's another world. The distance that felt significant in a basic light airplane starts shrinking rapidly. But speed is only the beginning. The really important change happens above the clouds. A pressurized aircraft capable of operating around 25,000 to 30,000 feet, depending on the design and configuration, gives you access to an entirely different part of the atmosphere. Instead of spending the flight bouncing around below weather systems, you're potentially flying above much of it. And imagine the difference from point 1. At $10,000, you're watching the wind. At $50,000, you're watching the weather before a regional trip. At $500,000, you're looking upward and thinking, can we just go above it? That's the kind of progression this price comparison is really about. The Lancair Evolution is a perfect example of how extreme personal aircraft can become. It combines turbine power with a high-performance airframe, giving the aircraft the kind of speed that starts making ordinary light aircraft look slow. Then there are aircraft like the Turbine Legend, which push the same basic idea from another direction. Take a personal airplane and give it serious turbine-powered performance. And the payload matters just as much as the speed. Depending on the aircraft and configuration, you're looking at the possibility of carrying 4 to 6 people, with some aircraft in this broader class capable of carrying 2,000 pounds or more of payload. That changes the mission completely. This isn't just you going flying on a Saturday morning anymore. This can become cross-country transportation. You can carry people. You can carry equipment. You can travel much farther without feeling like every trip is an endurance test. And now we reach the payoff promised at the beginning. Remember the $10,000 aircraft? It gave you something incredibly valuable: access to the sky. But you accepted low speed, open-air exposure, weather sensitivity, and almost no practical passenger capability. The $50,000 aircraft gave you something more. It turned flying into useful regional transportation. The $150,000 aircraft pushed the experience toward performance, technology, and adventure. But at $500,000, something genuinely strange happens. A personal aircraft can start entering the same performance conversation as light private jets. You're getting turbine power, high-speed cruise, pressurization, high-altitude capability, and serious payload. And depending on the aircraft and operation, you can potentially achieve that without stepping into the full cost structure of a conventional private jet. That's the part that sounds almost too good, because everyone assumes spending more simply means buying a bigger version of the same thing. It doesn't. The $500,000 aircraft isn't a $10,000 aircraft with more expensive parts. It's a completely different mission. At $10,000, you're buying freedom. At $50,000, you're buying practicality. At $150,000, you're buying performance and personality. And at $500,000, you're buying the ability to travel quickly, carry people and cargo, climb above the weather, and seriously challenge the idea that you need a private jet to travel like one. So if you had the money sitting in front of you right now, which would you choose? Would you take the cheap, almost unbelievably simple route and just get airborne? Would you choose the $50,000 airplane because it offers the best balance? Would the $150,000 sports car approach win you over? Or would you go all the way to the turbine machine? Because that's the strange lesson here. The most expensive aircraft isn't automatically the best aircraft. It's only the best one if its mission matches yours. 4 budgets gave us 4 completely different versions of personal aviation. At $10,000, you're buying access to the sky. At $50,000, you're buying usefulness. At $150,000, you're buying performance and technology. At $500,000, you're approaching private jet territory. So, honestly, which one would you choose? Let me know below.